In the spring of 1861, anxious bankers crowded around the doors of the United States Treasury. War had begun, and the North needed money, vast sums of money. But the tycoons of Wall Street kept their purses tightly shut. Investing in government bonds was like throwing money into a bottomless pit. Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase was desperate. He even considered borrowing money from his own friends. The situation in the South was no better. The Treasury in Richmond was equally empty. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had to scramble for funds wherever he could. The war would last 4 years and claim 750,000 lives, the deadliest conflict in American history. But the decisive factor was less the generals on the battlefield than the bankers on Wall Street and the accountants in the Treasury. Welcome to Finance Traveler, where we explore the epic stories of money, power, and capital across time. Before the Civil War, selling government bonds was an elite affair. Bonds came in large denominations, accessible only to wealthy individuals and institutional investors. Ordinary Americans kept their savings under mattresses, with almost no connection to financial markets. But the staggering cost of war forced the Northern government to find new ways to raise money. In 1862, Congress authorized the issuance of $500 million in long-term bonds. The Treasury tried to sell them on its own, but with little success. Then a Philadelphia banker named Jay Cooke stepped forward. Cooke made a revolutionary decision. He would sell bonds directly to ordinary Americans. He broke the bonds down into $50 denominations, small enough for a working man to afford. Then he hired 2,500 financial agents who fanned out into every small town and every farmhouse, selling door to door across the North and West. Cooke waved the flag of patriotism and also stressed the bonds' 6% tax-free interest. The results were astonishing. Cooke sold $500 million in bonds, reaching 5% of Northern households. The financial consciousness of the American people had been awakened. From under the mattress to government bonds, ordinary citizens had become participants in the nation's finances. But bond sales alone were not fast enough. In the early years of the war, the Union Army suffered defeat after defeat, and the price of federal bonds collapsed. To pay soldiers and buy supplies, the Lincoln administration made a bolder decision: print paper money. In 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the Treasury to issue $150 million in interest-free notes. Because the backs of these notes were printed in green ink, they were soon nicknamed greenbacks. This was the first time the United States had issued fiat currency, not backed by gold or silver. Greenbacks could not be redeemed for gold, nor could they be used to pay customs duties, but they could be used to pay all other public and private debts. In other words, the United States government was backing its currency with credit, not gold. It was a colossal gamble. If the North lost the war, the greenbacks would become worthless paper. The exchange rate between greenbacks and gold became a barometer of the war's progress. Financial markets sometimes reacted to war news in ways that historians found puzzling. In September 1862, the Union Army won a narrow victory at Antietam, and Lincoln followed it with the Emancipation Proclamation. Historians consider both events turning points in the war because the proclamation meant that slavery's foundation was beginning to crack, and the North's war aim had shifted from preserving the Union to ending slavery. But financial markets read the news as bad. The proclamation made reconciliation between North and South impossible, and the war would now grow even bloodier. The price of greenbacks in gold fell. It was not until July 1863, after the Union victory at Gettysburg, that financial markets became convinced the North would win. The most dramatic moment came in July 1864, when Confederate General Jubal Early led a raid that reached within 5 miles of the White House. Washington was thrown into a panic, but Early's force was too small and its supply line too weak. Fearing that Union troops would surround and destroy him, he withdrew. The crisis passed. Historians treat this as a minor episode, but in financial markets it sent the price of greenbacks soaring 96%. The market's logic was clear. This was a victory that cost nothing, a triumph that consumed no Northern lives or supplies, but greatly increased the certainty of ultimate Union victory. By the end of the war, the total issuance of greenbacks had reached $450 million. They had no gold backing, but they had won the trust that victory required. The Southern government never built a comparable financial network. Unable to raise money from ordinary citizens, it had no choice but to print money on a massive scale. The South's economic foundation was cotton, Before the war, 25% of the cotton used by the British textile industry came from the American South, and 90% of France's did. Southern leaders believed that by cutting off cotton exports, they could force Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy, and even intervene militarily. In financial terms, the Confederacy tried to use cotton as collateral to issue bonds in Europe. In 1863, the Confederate government partnered with the French banker Émile Erlanger to issue £15 million in Erlanger bonds. These bonds could be redeemed in cotton, meaning that holders could exchange their bonds for cotton after the war. The design looked clever, but European investors were skeptical. Britain and France had already abolished the slave trade, and openly supporting a regime built on slavery was politically toxic. Britain also had cotton plantations in Egypt and India, so Europe's cotton supply did not depend entirely on the South. More importantly, the Union naval blockade had already severely restricted Southern cotton exports, and investors feared that even if the South won, their bonds might never be redeemed. The Erlanger bonds sold far below expectations. The collapse of the Southern economy showed itself most brutally in the lives of ordinary people. By 1863, inflation in Richmond had reached horrifying levels. The purchasing power of a Confederate dollar had collapsed. A typical family of four spent $6.55 per week on food in 1860. By 1863, the same family needed $68 just to keep from starving. The price of flour and bacon had risen tenfold since the start of the war. People joked that you had to take a basket full of paper money to the market, but the food you brought home could fit in your wallet. On April 2, 1863, a crowd of hungry women gathered in Richmond, carrying axes and hammers, shouting bread or blood. They stormed into shops and warehouses, seizing flour, bacon, and clothing. President Jefferson Davis came to plead with them in person. He even took coins from his own pockets and handed them out. But it did no good. It was only when he threatened to open fire that the women slowly dispersed. The Confederate government could no longer even control its own capital. The condition of the Southern Army was equally desperate. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was ragged and starving. Soldiers went months without pay, and when they were paid, the Confederate paper was almost worthless. It took 60 Confederate dollars to buy $1 in gold. Beef cost $6 a pound. Flour cost $1,000 a barrel. By the end of the war, a soldier's monthly pay was worth just 33 cents in gold. The Confederate government printed more than $1.7 billion in paper money. By 1865, one Confederate dollar was worth less than 1 cent in gold. When news of Northern victory arrived, the life savings of countless Southerners vanished in an instant. A Confederate general later lamented, "We were not beaten by Northern soldiers. We were beaten by Northern finance." Ironically, though the South lost the economic war, its cotton played a powerful financial role in the North's hands. After Union forces occupied Southern territory, they seized cotton and shipped it to Europe for sale, bringing back large quantities of gold. That gold was used to stabilize the exchange rate of the greenback, further strengthening the North's financial position. The cotton the South had planted ultimately nourished the North's victory. The Northern government also built an extensive network for selling bonds in Europe, extending its war financing beyond national borders. Through the efforts of William Murphy, the American consul in Frankfurt, the German market became the largest buyer of American bonds in Europe. Murphy held receptions at his official residence, pitching the Union cause to bankers and ordinary citizens of Frankfurt. Investing in American bonds, he told them, meant investing in freedom and unity. At the same time, Amsterdam in the Netherlands became another important market for American bonds. By the spring of 1864, weekly trading volume in Amsterdam alone reached $2 million. This international financing marked the beginning of America's rise from the periphery of European finance toward the center. Before the war, the United States had depended on European capital to build its canals and railroads. After the war, American bonds were widely held around the world, and the United States had become a major participant in international capital markets. Beyond the conventional war, North and South fought a hidden monetary war, a war of counterfeit currency. Southern forgers targeted the greenback, printing fake notes with woodcut plates in an attempt to destroy the North's monetary credibility. The quality of these counterfeits varied widely. Some were crude, easily spotted, but others were well made, good enough to fool ordinary people. More surprisingly, the North was doing the same thing. A Northern merchant named Samuel Upham printed large quantities of fake Confederate currency and sold them as souvenirs. These fake notes actually circulated as money, worsening Southern inflation. Upham's counterfeits even had their own brand mark, a distinctive feature along the bottom edge of the note. The logic behind the counterfeit war was the logic of financial warfare. Destroy the enemy's monetary credibility, and you destroy his ability to fight. The Civil War was not only a military turning point, but also a watershed in American financial history. In 1863 and 1864, Congress passed the National Banking Acts, creating an entirely new national banking system. National banks were required to back their banknotes with federal government bonds. For every $90 in banknotes issued, a bank had to purchase $100 in government bonds. This mechanism not only created a stable demand for government bonds, but also ensured the value of banknotes since they were backed by bonds. Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase, was the architect of this new system. His ambition went beyond solving the immediate problem of war finance. He wanted to reform the entire American banking system. Chase succeeded. The national banking system gave the United States a unified, relatively stable currency, and it lasted until the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Yet the system had built-in flaws. Reserves were heavily concentrated in New York banks. The strongly seasonal nature of agricultural production meant that interior banks would call in loans and pull funds back to the countryside each autumn, putting extreme pressure on New York money markets and causing frequent financial panics. From 1862 to 1914, the United States suffered a serious financial crisis roughly once every 10 years. The legacy of the greenback was equally profound. It was America's first true fiat currency, marking the transition from a bimetallic gold and silver standard to credit money. After the war, a fierce political debate erupted over whether greenbacks should continue to circulate. Supporters argued they had been a necessary emergency measure. Opponents insisted they were a betrayal of sound money. In the end, greenbacks were made redeemable in gold again in 1879, but the principle of fiat currency had been established. The Civil War also gave birth to modern American investment banking. Before the war, American financial firms were mainly engaged in commercial paper and commodity trading. During the war, bankers like Jay Cooke focused on underwriting and selling government bonds, creating the modern investment banking model. After the war, these bankers turned their skills to underwriting railroad stocks and industrial bonds, providing essential capital for America's industrialization. Less than a decade after the war ended, a young businessman named John D. Rockefeller started an oil refinery in Cleveland. Part of his startup capital came from interest earned on government bonds he had bought during the war. But Rockefeller's rise was connected to wartime finance in deeper ways. Before the Civil War broke out, Rockefeller, barely 20 years old, saw the opportunity war would bring. He reasoned that war would create shortages, disrupt transportation, and send commodity prices soaring. Without any collateral, he wrote a business plan that impressed a bank president and borrowed a sum that was enormous for the time. He bought up Southern cotton, Michigan iron ore, Pennsylvania coal, and grain and ham. When the war began, prices shot up several times over. He sold at the right moment and pocketed a fortune in greenbacks. By the time the Civil War ended, he was no longer a small-time broker. He was a wealthy man, ready to enter the oil business. Rockefeller was not alone. An entire generation of post-war American entrepreneurs first encountered capital markets by buying war bonds and participating in the wartime economy. They learned to invest, to take risks, and to use other people's money to grow their own businesses. The Civil War did more than free the slaves. It freed America's financial potential. Ordinary Americans became participants in the nation's destiny for the first time by buying government bonds. Wall Street was transformed from a rich men's club into a mass market. America's financial hegemony began to take shape in the smoke of that war. The story of greenbacks and cotton bonds teaches us that victory in war depends not only on the courage and sacrifice of soldiers on the battlefield, but also on the trust and credit that operate far from the fighting. Subscribe to Finance Traveler. We trace the flow of capital across centuries and help you navigate the future with clarity.